What teacher made you realize that some people should never have power over children? I was in English class when my phone buzzed. It was my little sister, Layla. Alex, the doctors say it's happening. I don't want to die alone. My blood went cold. Layla was 11, and she was at the hospital by herself. The student teacher, Mrs. Garrett, saw my phone. Phone's away during state testing. My sister's dying. She has cancer, and the doctors just called her. I know all about your family situation. Mrs. Garrett cut me off coldly. The whole school knows. That doesn't mean you get special treatment. My classmates shifted uncomfortably. They'd all been at Mom's funeral 3 weeks ago. They'd seen Layla in her wheelchair, still clutching the birthday card Mom never got to open. Another text. The nurse says maybe an hour. Please come. I need you. Please! I shot up. She's alone! The doctor said she's dying. Mrs. Garrett's face hardened. She's been dying for months. Convenient timing for test day. Check her Instagram! Jasmine called out. Everyone knew Layla. She was the kid who still wore light-up sneakers to chemo and brought her stuffed elephant everywhere. I refreshed Instagram with shaking hands. Layla posted a video from her hospital bed. Oxygen tubes in her nose. Her tiny face so pale. If anyone sees my brother Alex, tell him I love him. The doctors say it's time. I'm scared to go alone. Mrs. Garrett walked to her desk and pulled out a metal lockbox. Phones in the box. State testing protocol. But my sister. Phones. Now. Or automatic failure and academic probation. She went row by row. Kids were trying to dial the hospital before dropping their phones in, but nothing would connect. The old building's concrete walls made half the school a dead zone. The landline! Ryan pointed to the classroom phone. Mrs. Garrett yanked the cord from the wall. No disruptions during state testing. My phone buzzed one last time before she snatched it. They're calling Dad, but he's in surgery. You're the only one who can come. Please. I don't want to die like Mommy did. Alone. She's dying alone! I screamed. Mrs. Garrett locked the phone box in her filing cabinet. Then she did something that made my blood run cold. She pulled out her keys and locked the classroom door from the inside. There. Now we can focus without disruptions. What are you doing? Bobby stood up. Following lockdown protocol. We practiced this last month. She smiled coldly. No one in or out until testing ends. Through the door's narrow window, I could see kids in the hallway heading to lunch. They couldn't hear us through the reinforced glass. Mrs. Garrett. Zoe's voice was shaking. His sister is 11. She's dying. Alone. She returned to her desk. Hospitals have nurses. She's not alone. My chest felt like it was caving in. Katie was at the window trying to force it open. These old windows only opened 6 inches. Safety protocol. Maybe someone will notice. David started. It's C Hall during lunch. Ryan said flatly. No one comes here for an hour. Mrs. Garrett pulled out her own phone, made sure we could all see her putting it in her drawer and locking it. See? I follow the same rules. That's called fairness. That's when something inside me snapped. Just like Mom always said, sometimes you have to choose between rules and what's right. I looked Mrs. Garrett dead in the eyes. You want to stop me? You'll have to physically stop me. Sit down right now or I picked up my chair. What are you? No! Crash. The window exploded. Glass everywhere. Alarms started shrieking. You're expelled! I was already climbing through. That's when I heard it behind me. Chairs scraping. Feet running. If he's expelled, I'm expelled. Ben's voice. Me too. Zoe. Move, Mrs. Garrett. I glanced back to see the entire class pushing past her, flooding through the broken window after me. Even quiet Elena. Even perfect grades David. Mrs. Garrett was screaming about police, about criminal charges, about ruined futures. I don't remember getting to the hospital. I just remember flying through the pediatric ward doors, racing to room 417. Layla was so small in that bed. Her breathing was so shallow. When I burst through the door, her eyes fluttered open. Alex, you came? I'm here, Lils. I'm right here. She squeezed my hand with what little strength she had left. I was so scared to go alone, like Mommy. The entire class burst through the door minutes later. They'd all followed me. Layla smiled weakly at them, then looked back at me. Now I'm not alone. She passed peacefully 20 minutes later, holding my hand, surrounded by love. Mrs. Garrett's teaching license was revoked in every state. Criminal charges are still pending. Good riddance. Or so I thought. Because when we were cleaning out Layla's hospital room, I found something in her diary that made my blood run cold. Alex, I need to tell you something about Mrs. Garrett she'd written the day before. The entry continued. She came to see Mom in the hospital. They were arguing. Mom kept saying, you'll never get them. Never. Mrs. Garrett said something about when you're gone. That's when I found it. Hidden in Layla's stuffed elephant. A letter in Mom's handwriting, dated the week before she died. And when I read the first line, I understood why she was willing to let an 11-year-old die alone. My hands shook as I smoothed out the crumpled paper on the waiting room table. Mom's handwriting filled 3 pages, and right there at the top she'd written that Mrs. Garrett had been trying to get custody of us for months. The letter explained everything. Mrs. Garrett was Dad's cousin's daughter, who'd lost her teaching job in Ohio for something called boundary issues with students. She'd shown up here 6 months ago, claiming she wanted to help our family. Mom wrote that Mrs. Garrett had been watching me at the school, and writing down every single thing I did wrong. She'd been building a file to prove I was too angry and violent to take care of Layla after Mom died. Every time I raised my voice in class or got frustrated with homework, Mrs. Garrett wrote it down and twisted it into evidence. Mom's letter said Mrs. Garrett planned to go to court the week after the funeral to get emergency custody. My hands wouldn't stop shaking as I pulled out my phone and started taking pictures of every page. I texted them to myself, then made a new email account just for this and sent them there too. The waiting room door opened and my whole class walked in. Ben asked if I was okay while Zoe handed me a pack of tissues from her backpack. I held up the first page of the letter and watched their faces change as they read it. Jasmine grabbed her phone and started taking her own pictures, while Bobby kept saying we needed to call the police right away. David mentioned his mom was a lawyer and pulled out his phone to call her. That's when I remembered what Layla had written about Mrs. Garrett visiting Mom. I dug through Layla's backpack until I found her diary with the sparkly unicorn cover. There were more entries I hadn't seen before. 2 weeks ago, she'd written that Mrs. Garrett brought papers to Mom's hospital room and Mom wouldn't sign them. Another entry from last month said Mrs. Garrett kept asking Layla weird questions about me. Did I ever yell at her? Did I get mad? Did I scare her? Layla had written in purple gel pen that she told Mrs. Garrett I was the best big brother in the whole world. Reading those words made me lose it completely. Ryan pulled out his phone and started a group chat with everyone from our English class. Within 10 minutes, we had statements from all 13 kids who were locked in that room. Katie typed out exactly what she saw, describing how Mrs. Garrett locked the door and pulled the phone cord from the wall. Ben wrote about hearing my sister's video and watching Mrs. Garrett smile while refusing to let me leave. Elena, who never talked in class, wrote 3 paragraphs about how scared she was watching an adult trap us during an emergency. Bobby documented the timeline minute by minute. Zoe described Mrs. Garrett putting her own phone in the drawer to prove she was being fair. Even David, who never got in trouble for anything, wrote about how wrong it felt to be locked in while someone's sister was dying. That evening, Dad finally got home from the hospital, and I showed him everything. His face went white as he read Mom's letter, and he had to sit down at the kitchen table. He kept shaking his head and saying he had no idea about any of this. He knew Mrs. Garrett was some kind of distant relative through his cousin, but didn't know about her past or why she really came here. He thought she was just trying to help our family during a hard time. He rubbed his face with both hands, and started telling me how Mrs. Garrett first showed up at the hospital 6 months ago while he was between surgeries. She said she was family through his cousin Margaret and wanted to help with us kids while Mom was sick. Dad pulled out his phone and showed me the texts she'd sent him. All these messages about wanting to support the family and how kids need stability during hard times. He thought having another adult around would be good for us, especially someone who worked at my school and could keep an eye on me. I asked him straight out if he knew she'd been visiting Mom in the hospital. His shoulders slumped and he admitted Mrs. Garrett had asked for Mom's room number a bunch of times. He gave it to her thinking she wanted to pray with Mom or bring her flowers or something normal relatives do. He never thought she was going there to pressure Mom about custody papers. We sat there for a minute just staring at all the evidence spread across the kitchen table. Dad picked up the phone and dialed 911, telling them we needed to report something about Mrs. Garrett. 20 minutes later, a cop showed up at our door, this older guy with a notepad who listened to everything and looked through Mom's letter. I wonder why Mrs. Garrett picked today of all days to show this side of herself so openly. The way she locked that door and pulled out the phone cord, that's not just following rules, that's something else entirely, isn't it? He took pictures of every page and wrote down what we told him, but then he said custody disputes were civil matters unless there was proof of an actual crime. He took a report and gave us a case number, but warned us not to expect much from the criminal side. The next morning, my phone rang while I was eating cereal, and it was the school secretary saying I needed to come in about the broken window. Dad grabbed his keys and said he was coming with me, and we made copies of Mom's letter at the library on the way there. Principal Weaver's office smelled like coffee, and those vanilla candles she always had burning. I sat in the leather chair across from her desk, while Dad stood behind me, and I started explaining everything from the beginning. She read Mom's letter, and her face went from confused to worried to completely shocked. She picked up her desk phone and called the district office, telling whoever answered that they needed Alden Proctor to come to the school immediately for an emergency investigation. While we waited for him to arrive, she pulled up Mrs. Garrett's personnel file on her computer and started scrolling through it. Her eyes got wider as she read something on the screen. She turned the monitor so we could see it and pointed to the part about why Mrs. Garrett left her last job. The application said personal reasons, but there was an attachment from her previous district that mentioned forced resignation due to boundary violations with students. Alden Proctor showed up an hour later with a briefcase and a digital recorder. He was this tall guy in a gray suit who shook our hands and said he took these matters very seriously. For the next 2 hours, he interviewed me about everything, recording every word and making copies of all our evidence. He kept asking about specific dates and times when Mrs. Garrett interacted with our family, writing notes in this leather notebook. He wanted to know exactly when she started visiting Mom, when she asked about custody, when she locked us in the classroom. Then he dropped something that made my stomach turn. 2 other families had already filed complaints about Mrs. Garrett trying to get too involved in their personal lives. One was a single dad whose wife died of cancer last year, and Mrs. Garrett kept showing up at his house offering to help with his kids. The other family had a mom with MS, and Mrs. Garrett had been asking their kids weird questions about their home life. That afternoon, I was sitting in my room when my phone rang with a number I didn't recognize. It was Rosa Arias, one of the nurses from the pediatric ward who'd taken care of Layla. She'd heard about the investigation from someone at the hospital and wanted to tell me what she saw. She confirmed that Mrs. Garrett had been arguing with Mom in her room about 2 weeks before Mom died. Rosa heard Mrs. Garrett say those kids need proper guidance in this really aggressive tone, while Mom kept saying no over and over. Rosa had been about to go in and check on them when Mrs. Garrett stormed out looking mad, but that wasn't even the worst part. Rosa also remembered Mrs. Garrett trying to get into Layla's medical records by claiming she was family. She'd gone to the nurse's station and asked to see Layla's charts, saying she was our aunt and needed to know about treatment options. When the nurses asked for ID proving she was family, Mrs. Garrett got upset and started making a scene about how the hospital was keeping family members in the dark. Security had to come up and escort her out of the building when she wouldn't leave on her own. Rosa said she'd filed an incident report about it, but didn't know if anyone had followed up. She gave me the date and time it happened and said she'd testify if we needed her to. The next morning at the school, I walked into total chaos with kids everywhere holding signs that said things like, "Fire Garrett now," and "Justice for Alex and Layla." Ben and Zoe had organized the whole thing overnight, texting everyone about what happened. Bobby was handing out flyers with a timeline of everything Mrs. Garrett did, from locking us in to letting my sister die alone. Even kids from other grades who didn't know me personally were joining in after hearing the story. Principal Weaver came out trying to get everyone to go to class, but nobody was moving. Katie's mom showed up with a megaphone and started leading chants about child safety. More parents kept arriving, pulling their cars right up to the front entrance and demanding answers. The local news van pulled up just as the district superintendent arrived, looking panicked. That's when Jasmine's dad, who was on the school board, announced they were calling an emergency meeting for that evening. By lunch, the protest had grown, so big that classes were basically canceled. Teachers were coming out to support us too, sharing their own concerns about Mrs. Garrett's behavior. Ryan's older brother, who graduated last year, posted about it on social media, and it went viral within hours. The school board meeting that evening was absolute madness, with every seat filled and people standing along the walls. Parents were taking turns at the microphone, sharing disturbing stories about Mrs. Garrett. One mom said Mrs. Garrett had asked really personal questions about their family finances during a parent conference. Another dad said she'd shown up at his workplace asking about his wife's medical condition. A single mom broke down crying, saying Mrs. Garrett kept offering to babysit her kids for free, which seemed nice at first, but got creepy. Then, the doors opened and Mrs. Garrett walked in, wearing this professional suit like nothing had happened. She went straight to the microphone and started talking about how this was all a big misunderstanding. She claimed I was an unstable student who had violent tendencies, and she was just following protocol. When someone shouted about Mom's letter, she actually smiled and said Mom was confused from the pain medication. That's when Dad stood up from where he'd been sitting quietly in the back. He walked to the front and told everyone that Mrs. Garrett was lying about everything. She suddenly blurted out that Dad had promised her she could help raise us after Mom died. Dad's face went completely red, and he called her a liar in front of everyone. The board members were looking at each other in shock as Mrs. Garrett kept insisting Dad had agreed to this. She said they discussed it at the hospital, and he'd been grateful for her offer to help. Dad pulled out his phone and showed texts where he'd specifically told her to stay away from us. The board voted right there to suspend her immediately while they investigated everything. 3 days later, Alden Proctor called to tell us what he'd found during his investigation. Mrs. Garrett had been researching guardianship laws for months before Mom even died. She'd bookmarked dozens of websites about custody proceedings and requirements for getting guardianship. She'd even consulted with a family lawyer named Roger Paulson about the process. The lawyer had kept all their emails because something felt wrong about the whole situation. He contacted the district himself, saying he was disturbed by what he'd learned after seeing the news. In the emails, Mrs. Garrett described our family as neglectful and claimed we were in danger. She wrote that Dad was never home because of work, and I couldn't properly care for Layla. She called us a broken family that needed someone stable to step in and save us. The lawyer had told her she didn't have grounds for custody, which apparently made her angry. She'd responded responded saying she would find a way to prove we needed her intervention. That same afternoon, a reporter from Channel 7 showed up at our house after parents had contacted them. Dad didn't want to talk at first, but I convinced him people needed to know the truth. The story aired that night, and within hours, people from Mrs. Garrett's past started coming forward. A principal from Idaho called the news station, saying she'd resigned from his school after similar problems. A family in Oregon posted on Facebook about how she tried to get custody of their kids. 3 different schools confirmed she'd been forced out for crossing boundaries with students and families. The next morning, a detective named Marta Baez from the Child Crimes Unit came to our house. She said this had gone way beyond a school matter and was now a criminal investigation. She interviewed me for 3 hours, recording everything and taking notes about every interaction with Mrs. Garrett. She interviewed all my classmates too, building a case for attempted fraud and conspiracy. During the investigation, Detective Baez found something that made everyone sick. Mrs. Garrett had been taking photos of me at the school without my permission for months. She had a whole file on her computer labeled evidence of instability with hundreds of pictures. The photos were just normal stuff like me laughing with friends or looking tired in class. She'd added captions to each one trying to make normal teenage behavior look concerning. One photo made Detective Baez actually gasp when she showed it to us. It was a picture of me crying at Mom's funeral, my face twisted in grief. Mrs. Garrett had written underneath it, emotional instability and inability to cope with loss. Even the detective, who'd seen terrible things in her job, looked shaken by how cruel that was. The hospital called Dad the next morning while we were eating breakfast. They wanted to meet with us about their own investigation into Mom's care records. We drove there in silence and met with the administrator in a small conference room. She pulled out a thick folder and showed us visitor logs from Mom's final weeks. Mrs. Garrett's name appeared 7 times, not the 2 visits she'd told everyone about. The administrator pointed to the dates, and I noticed something that made me sick. Something doesn't add up about Mrs. Garrett visiting Mom 7 times when she claimed only 2 visits. The hospital logs don't lie. So what was she really doing during those other 5 visits that she wanted to keep hidden? Each visit happened right before Mom got worse. After the first visit, Mom's blood pressure spiked. After the 3rd, she had breathing problems. After the 5th, her kidneys started failing. The administrator said they couldn't prove Mrs. Garrett did anything, but the pattern was disturbing. Then the head nurse from Layla's ward knocked on the door and came in with her own folder. She showed us phone records where Mrs. Garrett had called the pediatric ward 23 times asking about Layla. The calls always asked the same questions about life expectancy and how much time was left. The nurses thought it was weird, but didn't know who to tell since Mrs. Garrett claimed to be helping our family. One nurse had written notes about Mrs. Garrett trying to get medical details that weren't her business. Back at the school, my classmates were amazing through everything. Ben started bringing me lunch every day so I wouldn't have to go to the cafeteria alone. Bobby organized rides to and from the school when Dad couldn't drive me. Zoe made copies of all her notes and homework without me asking. Even Elena, who barely talked to anyone before, started sitting with me during free periods. She'd just sit there quietly, but her presence helped more than words could. She organized study groups at her house and made sure I didn't fall behind in any classes. 2 weeks after Layla died, the school held a memorial service in the auditorium. Every single person from our English class showed up wearing light-up sneakers like Layla used to wear. Teachers who'd had Mrs. Garrett as a student teacher came forward with their own stories. One said Mrs. Garrett had asked too many personal questions about students' home lives. Another mentioned she'd tried to get access to confidential student files. The math teacher said Mrs. Garrett had volunteered to do home visits, which wasn't normal for student teachers. During the service, Jasmine stood up and read a poem she'd written about Layla's bravery. She talked about the light-up sneakers and the stuffed elephant, and how Layla smiled even during chemo. People were crying everywhere, even the tough kids who never showed emotion. After the service, we all went outside to the courtyard, where maintenance had dug a hole for a tree. We planted it together, everyone taking turns with the shovel. The principal revealed a plaque that said, "In memory of Layla, who taught us that love is stronger than rules." 3 days later, the district investigator finished his report, and Dad got a copy. It was 47 pages long and listed 17 different policy violations Mrs. Garrett had committed. She'd lied on her application about previous employment. She'd accessed student records without permission. She'd violated boundaries with multiple families. The report recommended criminal prosecution and said she should never be allowed near children again. The investigator found evidence she'd been planning something with her family for months. That same afternoon, the police got a tip that Mrs. Garrett was at the bus station. Officers found her trying to buy a ticket to Florida with cash. She had 2 suitcases and had dyed her hair black to change her appearance. They arrested her right there at the ticket counter, while other passengers watched. She screamed that this was all a misunderstanding and she was just taking a vacation. The officers charged her with attempted custodial interference, fraud, and conspiracy to commit kidnapping. At her bail hearing 2 days later, the courtroom was packed with parents from the school. The prosecutor stood up and dropped a bomb that shocked everyone. Mrs. Garrett had done this before in 2 other states. In Montana, she tried to get custody of 3 kids whose mom had cancer. In Nevada, she targeted a family where the dad was dying. Both times, she'd positioned herself as the stable adult who could save the children. The families from those states sent statements describing her manipulation. The judge listened to everything with a grim expression on his face. When it was time to decide on bail, he called Mrs. Garrett a clear danger to children and a flight risk. He denied bail completely, which meant she'd stay in jail until trial. As the bailiffs led her away in handcuffs, she started screaming that she was only trying to help us. She yelled that we needed her and Dad couldn't take care of us alone. She kept playing the victim even as they dragged her out of the courtroom. That night, Dad broke down completely for the first time since Mom died. He blamed himself for letting Mrs. Garrett into our lives and couldn't stop apologizing to me. I showed him Mom's letter again where she specifically wrote not to blame him. Mom knew Mrs. Garrett was a master manipulator who fooled everyone. Dad started seeing a therapist the next week to deal with his guilt. The therapist helped him understand that predators like Mrs. Garrett are experts at finding vulnerable families. Dad went twice a week and slowly started to forgive himself for not seeing through her lies. 2 weeks later, I was going through Mom's jewelry box looking for her necklace to wear to court when my fingers found a folded paper stuck under the velvet lining. My hands shook as I opened another letter from Mom, this one addressed to both me and Dad, dated just 3 days before she died. She wrote that Mrs. Garrett was the best liar she'd ever met, someone who could convince anyone of anything, and we shouldn't blame ourselves for not seeing through her act when even trained professionals at her old schools had been fooled. The letter explained how Mrs. Garrett had volunteered at the hospital for months before Mom got sick, learning about vulnerable families and waiting for the perfect target. Mom begged us to forgive ourselves because predators like Mrs. Garrett spend years perfecting their manipulation. I showed Dad the letter that night and watched the guilt finally start to leave his eyes. The next week, the school board held an emergency meeting where they announced new rules requiring all student teachers to provide 3 references from previous schools and pass expanded background checks. They named it Layla's Law after my sister, and every parent in the packed auditorium stood up and clapped while I sat there trying not to cry. The principal said they'd also hired a full-time counselor just to monitor respect her student-teacher boundaries and investigate any concerns immediately. 3 months crawled by before Mrs. Garrett's trial finally started on a cold Monday morning in March. The courthouse was packed with reporters and parents from the school, all wanting to see justice for what she'd done. I had to testify on the second day, sitting in that witness chair and telling a room full of strangers about the worst day of my life. The prosecutor asked me to describe breaking the window while my sister was dying alone, and I had to stop twice because I couldn't breathe through the memories. She had me read parts of Mom's letters out loud, and several jury members wiped their eyes when I got to the part about Layla being scared to die alone. The defense attorney tried to make me look unstable, asking about my grades dropping after Mom died and the window incident, but the prosecutor objected and the judge shut him down. On day 3, my classmates testified one by one about what they saw in the classroom. Ben went first, describing how he followed me through the broken window because he knew it was the right thing to do, even if it meant getting expelled. His voice cracked when he told the jury about seeing Mrs. Garrett lock the door and take the phones while knowing an 11-year-old girl was dying alone. Zoe testified next, explaining how Mrs. Garrett had smiled while denying me the chance to be with my dying sister. Bobby told the court about Mrs. Garrett yanking the phone cord from the wall to prevent any calls to the hospital. Even quiet Elena took the stand, her voice steady as she described the cold look on Mrs. Garrett's face when she said hospitals have nurses, so Layla wasn't really alone. David testified last, using his perfect memory to give exact quotes of everything Mrs. Garrett said that day. The defense attorney tried to paint Mrs. Garrett as mentally ill and misunderstood, bringing in a psychologist who'd never actually met her to talk about stress and poor judgment. But the prosecutor destroyed that story by presenting boxes of evidence showing Mrs. Garrett's careful planning over months. They had her personal notebooks where she'd written detailed plans about getting custody of me and any insurance money from Mom. The prosecutor showed emails where Mrs. Garrett researched guardianship laws and even looked up how much Social Security orphans receive. They found Google searches on her computer about how to prove a parent is unfit and emergency custody procedures dating back 6 months. On day 4, families from Montana and Nevada testified by video link about Mrs. Garrett's previous attempts to steal their children. A mother from Montana broke down sobbing as she described how Mrs. Garrett had convinced her dying husband to sign papers making her the kid's guardian, papers that thankfully weren't legal because they weren't notarized. A father from Nevada explained how Mrs. Garrett had called CPS on him 12 times with false reports while his wife was in hospice care. Another family described finding Mrs. Garrett in their house at 2 a.m., claiming she was just checking on the children after their mom's death. The prosecutor presented records showing Mrs. Garrett had been fired from 3 different schools for boundary violations with students. After 5 days of testimony, the jury went to deliberate at 2 p.m. on a Friday afternoon. We waited in a small room down the hall, Dad holding my hand while the window crew sat around us for support. At 5:47 p.m., the bailiff came to get us because the jury had reached a verdict. My legs felt like jelly. Walking back into that courtroom, Mrs. Garrett called Layla's ward 23 times, asking the same questions about how much time was left. That's not concern, that's calculating. Those phone records make me wonder if she was waiting for the perfect moment to make her move with our family. The jury foreman stood up and read guilty on all 14 counts, including attempted kidnapping, fraud, conspiracy, and custodial interference. Mrs. Garrett's face went white, and she grabbed the defense table like she might fall over. The judge scheduled sentencing for 2 weeks later and denied the defense's request to let her stay free on bail. At the sentencing hearing, I had to read my victim impact statement to the court. I stood at the podium with shaking hands and told them about Layla's last moments, how she was terrified of dying alone like Mom, and how Mrs. Garrett tried to make that happen just to hurt me. I explained how Mrs. Garrett used my sister's death as an opportunity to try stealing us, turning the worst day of my life into part of her sick plan. The judge's face got harder with every word I read. When I finished, the judge sentenced Mrs. Garrett to 15 years in prison with no possibility of early release. She called Mrs. Garrett a predator who targeted grieving families at their most vulnerable moments. As the bailiffs put handcuffs on Mrs. Garrett to take her away, she started screaming that she was innocent and we'd all regret this. She yelled that she only wanted to help us and that Dad was the real criminal for neglecting his children. The detective who'd worked our case told us afterward that Mrs. Garrett would be on a national registry that prevents her from ever working with children again, even after she gets out of prison. 2 weeks after the trial ended, the school held a mandatory assembly about recognizing predatory behavior and the importance of speaking up when adults cross boundaries. They brought in experts who explained how predators choose vulnerable targets and slowly break down normal boundaries over time. The whole school had to attend, and they gave us wallet cards with warning signs to watch for and phone numbers to call if we ever felt unsafe with an adult. 3 weeks after the assembly, Dad and I walked into the pediatric ward carrying a box of books and stuffed animals we'd bought at Target. The head nurse recognized us from when Layla was there and showed us to the playroom where 8 kids were waiting for story time. I sat on the floor and started reading Where the Wild Things Are while Dad handed out the toys to kids hooked up to IV poles. A little boy with no hair grabbed onto Dad's leg and wouldn't let go until Dad picked him up and let him sit on his lap for the whole story. We went back every Saturday after that, bringing different books and toys each time. The kids started calling me Story Guy, and Dad became Mr. Toys, and seeing them smile made the empty feeling in my chest hurt a little less. 6 months passed like that, with Dad and I finding ways to fill the silence in our house by helping other kids fight what Layla couldn't beat. We started cooking dinner together every night instead of ordering takeout, and he taught me how to make Mom's lasagna recipe that she never wrote down. During those cooking sessions, we'd talk about Layla and Mom without crying, sharing funny memories like when Layla tried to teach the cat to wear her light-up sneakers. The window crew met up every Friday at the pizza place near school, our table always reserved in the back corner where we'd first gathered after breaking through that classroom window. Ben started a group chat where we shared everything from homework help to panic attack support at 2 a.m. Zoe made matching bracelets with window charms that we all wore every day. Bobby got into 3 fights defending me from kids who said I was crazy for breaking the window, and even quiet Elena started speaking up in class when teachers got too harsh with students. We weren't just classmates anymore, but something stronger, bound by glass and grief and doing what was right. David's mom called a meeting at her law office downtown, where she laid out papers for a civil suit against Mrs. Garrett and the school district. She explained how the district failed to properly vet Mrs. Garrett and ignored warning signs, making them liable for emotional distress and endangerment. The settlement negotiations took 4 months, with the district finally agreeing to pay into a special fund that would help families identify and fight custody predators. David's mom didn't charge us anything, saying what we went through was payment enough for her to fight this battle. Spring came, and suddenly, it was graduation day, with all of us in our caps and gowns sweating in the June heat. Principal Weaver gave her speech about courage and choosing right over rules, and when she mentioned Layla's name, the entire graduating class stood up and clapped for 5 minutes straight. I had to wipe my eyes with my graduation gown sleeve, while Dad filmed everything from the 3rd row. After the ceremony, I was headed heading to find Dad when Rosa Arias appeared with 4 other nurses from Layla's ward. They handed me an envelope with official letterhead, announcing the Layla and Mom Memorial Scholarship for nursing students, funded by donations from the hospital staff who remembered them. Rosa hugged me tight and whispered that Layla changed how she thought about her job, making her remember why she became a nurse in the first place. That summer, I stood in front of 40 teachers at a district training seminar, my hands shaking as I explained how Mrs. Garrett used her position to target our family. I showed them the warning signs we missed, the boundary violations that seemed small at first, and how predators choose vulnerable families. After my presentation, 12 teachers came up to share their own concerns about colleagues, finally feeling safe enough to speak up. I did 6 more seminars that summer, each one getting easier as I learned to turn our pain into something that could protect other kids. Dad met Audrey at his grief support group in August, when she shared her story about losing her husband to the same cancer that took Mom. She didn't try to fix Dad or tell him everything would be okay, just sat with him in the sadness and understood why some days were harder than others. They started getting coffee after meetings, then dinner once a week, and by October she was coming over to help us cook Mom's recipes. She never tried to replace Mom, just became this gentle presence who helped us remember that loving again didn't mean forgetting. The first anniversary of Layla's death fell on a Saturday, and the entire window crew showed up at the cemetery at 8 a.m. with flowers and stories to share. Ben brought photos from the day we all climbed through the window. Zoe read a poem she wrote about light-up sneakers, and Bobby played Layla's favorite song on his phone. We sat in a circle around her headstone telling stories, like how she used to insist her stuffed elephant needed its own seat at the dinner table, and how she'd wear her light-up sneakers to chemo to cheer up the other kids. Elena spoke the most she ever had, describing how Layla's courage made her brave enough to start standing up for herself. We cried and laughed and stayed there until the cemetery closed, promising to come back every year. 2 weeks later, I got my college acceptance letter for the social work program at the State University, and the window crew threw me a surprise party at the pizza place. Elena actually gave a speech about how watching me fight for Layla taught her that rules weren't always right, and family was more than blood. They gave me a photo album filled with pictures from the past year, including ones from the trial, the graduation, and all our Friday night dinners, with Window Crew Forever written on the cover. Dad cried when he saw it, saying Mom would be so proud of the family I'd found and the person I was becoming. The week before I left for college, I drove to the women's prison 2 hours north of town with my acceptance letter in my pocket and Mom's letter in my backpack. The guard at the front desk took my ID and searched my bag while I signed the visitor log and waited for them to bring Mrs. Garrett to the visiting room. She looked smaller in the orange jumpsuit when she shuffled in with her hands cuffed, her hair gray at the roots without her usual dye job. I sat down across from her at the metal table and pulled out Mom's letter, spreading it flat between us so she could see every word Mom wrote about her plans. Mom knew everything, I said. She tried to reach for the letter, but the guard stepped forward and she pulled her hands back. Your mother misunderstood my intentions. I folded the letter and put it back in my bag. She understood perfectly, and she stopped you. Mrs. Garrett leaned forward, and her voice got soft and fake sweet like it used to in the classroom. Alex, I loved you and Layla like my own children. I only wanted to help after your mom got sick. I stood up and walked to the door without looking back. The guard told me 3 days later when I called to check that Mrs. Garrett had thrown her food tray at the wall after I left and screamed for an hour about ungrateful children before they put her in solitary. My first semester at State University, I took Introduction to Child Psychology with Professor Martinez, who had us share personal experiences related to course material. When I told my story about Mrs. Garrett during the unit on predatory behavior, the whole class went silent, and Professor Martinez asked me to stay after class. She wanted to know if I'd help develop a new curriculum module about family predators who use positions of authority to target vulnerable families. I spent the rest of the semester researching similar cases and interviewing experts, turning it into my senior thesis project that would take 3 more years to complete. Dad called me in October of my freshman year while I was studying in the library. The window crew started something, he said, and I could hear the pride in his voice. Ben and Zoe had organized the whole class to create a nonprofit called Light Up Sneakers Foundation after Layla's favorite shoes, and they'd already identified 3 families being targeted by people in positions of trust. Bobby was handling the legal paperwork, while Elena, who'd found her voice after that day, was running support groups for siblings of sick kids. 15 years in prison for Mrs. Garrett makes me wonder if there's more to her past than we know about, since that's a really long sentence for a first offense. They'd raised $20,000 at their first fundraiser and rented a small office space downtown next to the pizza place where we used to meet. I changed my major to social work the next day and spent every school break working with them to build the organization. 4 years went by faster than I expected with classes and internships and thesis work, but finally graduation day came, and the entire window crew was there in the audience cheering louder than anyone when I walked across the stage with my degree. They'd saved a position for me at the nonprofit, which had grown to 6 full-time staff members and helped 47 families recognize and stop predatory behavior. We worked 18-hour days that first year back, creating training materials and assessment tools that other organizations started requesting. Within 2 years, we'd opened chapters in 12 states with standardized protocols for identifying what we called Garrett patterns, after the woman who'd shown us what to watch for. The national news picked up our story when we helped stop a teacher in Ohio who'd been following the exact same playbook Mrs. Garrett had used, and suddenly we were getting calls from everywhere. We hired more staff and moved to a bigger office, but we kept Layla's stuffed elephant on the desk in the lobby and her picture on every piece of literature we sent out. Dad had been dating Audrey for 3 years by then, and when he told me he wanted to propose, we went together to pick out a ring that reminded us of Mom's without copying it. The wedding was small, just family, and the window crew in the hospital garden where they'd installed Layla's memorial bench under an oak tree. Dad had asked them to plant light-up solar flowers around the bench that glowed at night like her sneakers used to, and when the ceremony started at sunset, they were just beginning to shine. Audrey had written her own vows about how loving Dad didn't mean replacing Mom, but honoring the love that came before, and there wasn't a dry eye in the garden. The reception was in the hospital cafeteria, where the staff had decorated with photos of all the kids Layla had cheered up during her treatments, and Rosa gave a speech about how Layla's bravery had inspired the whole pediatric ward. Looking at Dad dancing with Audrey while the window crew sang the song Bobby had played at Layla's grave, I pulled out Mom's letter one more time and read the last line she'd written. Love is stronger than evil. Always remember that when things seem dark. Mom had fought Mrs. Garrett even while dying, protecting us with her final strength, making sure that woman could never hurt another family the way she'd tried to hurt ours. Well, folks, that's all I've got for today. Thanks for hanging out with me and letting me ramble through all those little details. I always love diving into this stuff with you. Until next time, stay curious and keep exploring. If you made it to the end, drop a comment. I love reading all your comments.